friends, it's me Mary coming at you with another video. It is again 41 degrees today and I'm dying, but you know, I'm used to dying of heat exhaustion. Thank you guys for all your views and comments and likes on my Sherlock critique videos. I'm just hitting my furniture. I'm going to be doing a gaggle of videos in which I compare Elementary to Sherlock as modern day adaptations of Conan Doyle's original stories. This first video I'm going to be looking at how does Sherlock Holmes shape his narrative and function within it in both the shows, and how are they different from each other. I'm not going to try and tell you which show that you should watch. I mean, I watch both. I'm just comparing them because I'm a Sherlock Holmes nerd and I have quite a bit of spare time because I'm on holidays from uni. In the original Conan Doyle stories, Sherlock Holmes is definitely the protagonist. He's a puzzle solver, and even though we mostly know him through Dr. Watson's perspective, Sherlock Holmes is the person who dictates where the narrative goes all the time. As I've said in previous videos, Dr. Watson's function in the Sherlock Holmes narrative is to basically ask the questions that we can't and lend some legitimacy to Holmes's work as a doctor. Like, this army doctor thinks this nut job is worth your time and worth your money, so it must be legit. It's also interesting to think about that because Dr. Watson does admire Holmes so much, Holmes's flaws are rarely ever painted in a negative light by him, and he is always seen as the hero whose strength is his ability to think and also his willingness to help those who are in most need of it. Often any development in Holmes's character is not verbalized by himself but rather assumed by Dr. Watson. For example, that whole "to Sherlock Holmes she's always the woman" thing that Adlock shippers love to quote, that's not actually said by Sherlock himself, it's sort of more postulated by Dr. Watson. There are a couple of lines where Sherlock remarks that Irene's attractive, but for the most part he doesn't really admit his feelings. It's more just Dr. Watson being like, pretty sure he wanted to bone her. As for self-reflection, in stories like The Adventure of the Empty House, which is the one where Sherlock comes back from the dead, he sort of apologised to Watson. It's actually one of my favourite lines in the Sherlock Holmes stories. My dear Watson, I owe you 1,000 apologies. I didn't know it would affect you so. Watson sort of faints and then the game's afoot, so we don't have time to sort of reflect on where I was for 3 years. And so even in these moments, like, Holmes's narrative is prioritised over Watson's feelings, and it's never actually sort of looked back on, so it doesn't really impact Holmes much as a character, or Dr. Watson for that matter. And all of this is because Holmes's function in the original stories was to simply be clever, and anything else beyond that was given to us by Dr. Doyle, probably because he was bored or off his face on drugs. Fast forward 100 years and 1,000 adaptations and we have BBC Sherlock. Our first image of Benedict's version of Sherlock Holmes is through the eyes of a corpse in a body bag, which I always thought was a really cool way to introduce him. But for the most part, A Study in Pink really does operate the same as its Victorian counterpart, A Study in Scarlet. Not much is deviated from that plot. And Benedict's Sherlock translates Holmes pretty much unchanged into the 21st century. Really the only things that change about Holmes's character is the aesthetics and of course the way in which he gets his drugs. So in Victorian era, opium was like the cool thing that the kids did on Friday night. Like, they had opium dens where like rich people could pay. It wasn't something that was tabooed, it was something that was mostly accepted, and therefore something that was not really fussed over that much in the original Holmes stories. But as pop culture has progressed and so has, you know, health standards, we have come to see Holmes's addiction as an addiction. In modern day London, Holmes is addicted to some kind of opium derivative. This is apparently so widely accepted that no one actually arrests him, even though everyone seems to know that Sherlock does do drugs in BBC Sherlock. He has such a more enhanced mind palace when he's on the drugs. They're sort of glorified as a way to increase his intellect. And because of that, Sherlock in Sherlock never ever faces any sort of consequences that are permanent from his drug use. The best example of this is actually in The Lying Detective. Sherlock sort of drugs himself up inside a hospital and no one goes to stop him. Even John, who is concerned about his well-being and about how many drugs he has taken, he just sort of lets him shoot up, and he's like, right, you done? Let's go. And this is a common theme throughout BBC Sherlock. Sherlock's use of drugs is pretty much enabled by everybody around him and glorified as a way to make him more clever, and this was essentially the premise of The Abominable Bride. It was sort of the whole thing that episode was built on, and it's one of the reasons why that episode was terrible, except for every scene with Moriarty in it, because I love Moriarty. This way, Moffat and Gatiss have their version of Sherlock pretty much function the exact same way as Conan Doyle had his version of Sherlock. No matter what Sherlock Holmes does, whether it's good, bad, or worse, it's forgiven and completely justifiable because of his apparently indestructible intellect. And while this is all fine and good when it comes to writing superheroes, it comes off as slightly arrogant and unrealistic when you're writing about a man who is essentially just a man with a pretty good brain. No matter how mean or destructive Sherlock is in BBC Sherlock, he never faces any backlash. Everyone around him excuses it. Everybody. Like, think about this. He literally destroys Irene Adler's life and then tells her, like, yeah, okay, you probably won't last 6 months without this phone, but I don't really care. And then he swoops in and saves her at the last minute. And that's sort of all justified as being romantic simply because, ooh, he was so clever and he outsmarted Mycroft. He let his best friend believe that he was dead, right? But that's okay, right? Because he was outsmarting Moriarty. Right? He overdosed on drugs, but that's okay, right? Because he got John back on his side and saved the day, right? Moffat and Gatiss's inability to allow Sherlock to face up to his wrongdoings by having everyone forgive him for everything means that Sherlock's growth as a character in BBC Sherlock is somewhat stunted. Any apparent change in his character is more like an adaptation to a certain situation rather than an actual permanent change. This is something I like to call Sheldon Syndrome. When I was watching Big Bang Theory with my dad and my brother once, I realized that Sheldon is a terrible person. He's mean to everyone around him, and yet everyone around him seems to always automatically forgive him of all this simply because they know that he's smart. It is very rare that Sheldon in Big Bang Theory faces any permanent consequences for his neglectful behaviour, even when his girlfriend in the show, Amy Farrah Fowler, breaks up with him because he is being so neglectful. She often ends up back with him simply after he promises that he will do the bare minimum. This trope is more common than you think, and is especially common when you have a show about white men written by white men. This trope is a blatant display of white male privilege. Men do not have to experience consequences for their actions because guess what? In reality, they don't. Just look at peeps like Trump and Johnny Depp and Casey Affleck. 3 men who have committed horrible atrocities against women and other groups of people and yet still have very illustrious careers. I rest my case. But in Sherlock, the Sheldon Syndrome is something that we see where Sherlock sort of goes through the motions of dating Janine without sort of ever considering this could actually hurt somebody's feelings. Only thing he has to lose is his connection with Janine. But we know that he doesn't really value this connection because otherwise he wouldn't be doing this. The loss of Janine as a friend clearly doesn't impact Sherlock that much because it doesn't affect his behaviour towards women in future episodes. In The Lying Detective, he literally admits that he always ignores Irene's texts, and we as an audience forgive him for that because clearly Irene does that. I don't know any woman in their right mind who would text a man for 5 years after he barely ever texts back. As an audience, we're meant to forget that he, as a 40-year-old man, Sherlock Holmes, really should know how to respond to a text message and know that neglecting relationships lead to a loss. But this doesn't happen because, you guessed it, Sheldon Syndrome. Just watch Sherlock be rude to anybody and ask yourself if a woman or a person of colour, or basically anyone who isn't a cis white man, did what Sherlock did, would they get away with it the same way he does? The answer is probably no. However, Sheldon Syndrome is not as much of an epidemic in Elementary as it is in BBC Sherlock. Not only because the show has a more diverse cast and crew, which I will make a video about in the future, but the big difference between Jonny Lee Miller's Sherlock and BBC Sherlock's version of Sherlock is that Jonny Lee Miller does not operate in a world where everyone magically forgives him for all of his bad behaviour. In other words, he lives in the real world. Elementary makes it categorically clear that Sherlock's involvement with the NYPD is completely conditional on his behaviour. In the very first episode, when Sherlock drives a car into some other asshole's car, he's thrown in prison for the night and is only bailed out because of Joan and is suspended from consulting with the NYPD, and that's not the only time that happens. In season 4, Sherlock and Joan are suspended from the NYPD after Sherlock literally nearly kills a man, until both of them make amends for their actions. This is such a massive contrast to BBC Sherlock. Sherlock straight up murdered a man at the end of season 3, and at the beginning of season 4, that murder is literally edited out of the story and never spoken about again. If you or I went out into the street and murdered a man in cold blood, we wouldn't just get off because, oh well, you know, I'm pretty clever and my brother edited a video, so I didn't murder anyone. But in Elementary, Sherlock not only faces the external consequences for his actions, so dealing with the law and the courts, he also faces internal conflict and consequences. He self-reflects that his drug problem got out of control, and he begins attending addict meetings to help himself. Something that he is seen to be doing continuously throughout all 5 seasons of Elementary. In BBC Sherlock, when Sherlock lets relationships go, they don't seem to impact him that much. However, in Elementary, Sherlock reflects almost continuously upon the relationships that have been lost due to his arrogance or drug addiction. My favourite moments of Elementary is when Sherlock finds out that one of his old school friends has died of a terminal illness, and he spends, I think, about 2 or 3 episodes grieving for him and reflecting that he should have helped him when he goes to his friend's grave, and admits that he misses him and apologises for offending him and hurting him over the years. Sherlock's failure in Elementary to teach Kitty Riley how to be a detective is still impacting his decisions even in more recent episodes, when Joan's ex-client asks if he can be trained as a private eye. Sherlock refuses to do it because he still feels guilty over his inability to care for Kitty. This self-reflection of Johnny Lee Miller's version of Sherlock Holmes not only allows him to grow as a character, but also allows him to develop new friendships, such as his friendship with the adorable Morgue Man, which I've forgotten, but Sherlock and him now play chess. Also healing old relationships, such as his one with Jamie Moriarty. Even Jamie admits to him on their 2nd or 3rd meeting that we see that she has even become a better person because of watching how much Sherlock has changed. While the Sherlocks in both shows are brilliant in their own ways, for instance, I think that Benedict is a beautiful Sherlock Holmes in the literal sense of the word, that he is just a very beautiful human being, and I enjoy watching him and his cheekbones. And of course, Johnny Lee Miller's version of Holmes is probably the sweetest version of Sherlock Holmes. I just love that boy. Don't watch an episode of Elementary with me because I just cry. But in both shows, Sherlock functions as the clever person in the room. But his intellect is used very differently by the writers. BBC Sherlock's intellect is used to excuse him of any human error. By default, keep him mostly unchanged as a character. The writers over in the Elementary camp see Sherlock's intellect as a complicated part of a complicated man. The fundamental difference between the way Sherlock Holmes functions in Sherlock and how he functions in Elementary is that BBC Sherlock is the centre of his universe, while Elementary Sherlock is only one part of his. Subscribe or comment or have a chat to me on Tumblr. If you have any ideas that you want me to talk about with Sherlock Holmes, and tell me what your favourite moment is with either Benedict's Sherlock or Johnny Lee Miller's, and why you think that moment is so special or impactful or anything like that. Anyway guys, I'll see you next week. The video I'll put up next week will probably be a slightly older video, just because I am on holidays and probably won't be able to film. Yeah. Bye guys, thank you for watching.